It was a quiet morning. The kind where everything felt still, the world just beginning to wake up. Birds were chirping, and the sun's first light peeked through the trees. For one man, it was the perfect time for a jog. He laced up his shoes, stretched his legs, and set out on a familiar path, a peaceful route through a suburban neighborhood. His mind wasn't on anything specific, just the rhythm of his breath and the steady pounding of his feet against the pavement. But this jog would be different from all the others. As he rounded a corner, he noticed a woman standing near her car, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. She could have been a neighbor, maybe someone who was just out for a walk. But then, something shifted. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. The words that followed would set off a chain of events no one saw coming. "There's a man jogging in our neighborhood," she said, her voice filled with a sense of urgency. "I don't know if he belongs here. He's acting suspicious." The woman didn't know him, didn't know anything about him, and yet, the very act of him running through the neighborhood, an act that was as harmless as breathing, was enough for her to feel threatened. The jogger, oblivious to what was unfolding, continued his run, unaware that the scene was about to take a turn. As the call to the authorities went out, a sense of dread began to creep into the morning air. On the other end of the line, the operator asked her what seemed like simple questions. "Where are you? What does he look like? And then, is he doing anything wrong?" The woman described the jogger as suspicious, her tone wavering as she added, "I don't know, but he's not someone I've seen around here before." By now, the jogger had no idea that his morning exercise was being watched, scrutinized. He'd run this route 100 times before, but this time, the narrative was being written for him by someone who had never taken the time to get to know him. For her, the jogger's presence, his black skin, his unfamiliarity in the neighborhood was enough to cast him as a threat. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they neared. The jogger's heart rate picked up. He wasn't sure why, but he could sense something was wrong. By the time the police officers arrived, he was on the last stretch of his route. They didn't pull up quietly. Their sirens blared, their lights flashing, drawing attention from everyone nearby. It was clear, this was no ordinary stop. As the officers got out of their cars, the jogger knew something was off. He had never been treated like this before. They told him to stop, to turn around, to raise his hands. He complied, confused, feeling the weight of their presence press down on him. All the while, the woman stood at the edge of the scene, watching, her eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and something else. Was it fear? Guilt? It was impossible to tell. The jogger's heart raced. Was this happening because of a simple misunderstanding? Was this how people who didn't fit the mold were treated? And for the woman? She stood there, watching her actions unfold, not fully grasping the gravity of what had just been set into motion. And that's where the story could have ended. The tension could have dissipated. But it didn't. As the jogger tried to explain himself, trying to make sense of the situation, the woman had already made up her mind. She didn't see him as just a person, as a fellow neighbor, as someone just trying to get through the morning. No, in her eyes, he was something else entirely. And once she realized the consequences of her actions, it was already too late. What would happen next? Would the jogger's life be upended by an unfortunate set of assumptions? Would the woman realize the impact of her call, and what it might cost them both? Stay tuned. This story doesn't end here. The jogger stood there, frozen, his mind racing as he watched the two officers approach him. It felt as though time had slowed, and the air around him thickened. He wasn't used to being treated like this, not here, not in his own neighborhood. His steps, his breathing, the rhythm of his jog, all suddenly seemed irrelevant, drowned out by the weight of the moment. The officers' eyes were fixed on him, their stances firm. They didn't seem to show any signs of recognizing the routine jogger they'd seen countless times in their patrols. No, this time, he was just another call to respond to, another potential threat to assess. They didn't know that he was simply running, just as anyone else might on a crisp morning. They didn't know that the only thing he wanted in that moment was to finish his route and head back home. "Can you stop for a moment, sir?" one of the officers asked, his voice steady but commanding. "Of course," the jogger said, his voice tight with confusion but not defiance. He slowed his pace, coming to a complete stop as they asked, "Is there something wrong?" "We received a report about a suspicious person in the area." "Can you tell us what you're doing here?" the other officer asked, his tone not unfriendly but not quite warm either. The jogger's brow furrowed. "I'm just out for a run." "I do this every day," he said, his gaze flicking toward the woman, still standing off to the side. She was now looking at her phone, eyes darting nervously between him and the officers. Her presence was unsettling, and he could tell she was still watching closely, probably waiting for the situation to escalate. The officers exchanged a quick look before turning back to him. "Where do you live?" He hesitated. He wasn't sure why they were asking. His neighborhood was small, and it shouldn't have been unusual for anyone to be out jogging. But with the flashing lights and the tension in the air, he felt like he was already being judged. "I live a few blocks over," he said, pointing vaguely in the direction of his house. One of the officers nodded, then gestured toward the woman. "Did you know her?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. The jogger glanced over at the woman again. She wasn't looking at him now, her attention still focused on her phone. "No," he replied, feeling an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. "Well, she called in about a suspicious person," the officer said. There was a pause, as if they were waiting for him to respond, to say something that would give them more to go on. But he didn't. There was nothing to explain, nothing to justify. All he was doing was running, and now he was stuck in a conversation that felt like it was spiraling beyond his control. The officers didn't seem to be in a hurry to wrap things up. They kept their distance, observing him as if he might suddenly snap or do something dangerous. The jogger tried to remain calm, but with each passing second, his sense of discomfort deepened. He had nothing to hide, no reason to fear, but the situation felt increasingly surreal. Behind the police officers, the woman was still standing there, her body tense, hands clasped tightly around her phone. She hadn't said anything else since the call went through. Her silence was deafening. He tried to ignore her, but the weight of her gaze felt like it was pressing on him, her eyes following every move he made. He couldn't understand why this was happening. Was it because of the way he looked? Was it because of the color of his skin? The thought made his stomach churn, but he quickly pushed it aside. He didn't want to think like that. But as the silence stretched on, he realized that his presence here, his simple, peaceful jog, had been enough to set off an entire chain of events. And the woman hadn't even thought to approach him, to ask him what he was doing. Instead, she'd chosen to call the authorities, labeling him suspicious without so much as a second thought. Meanwhile, the officers seemed to be losing their patience. One of them stepped closer to the jogger, their hand hovering near the sidearm strapped to his belt. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. It made the jogger's pulse quicken. Why was he being treated like this? "Can you show us your ID?" the officer asked, his voice no longer as neutral as before. The jogger's mind raced. Of course, he carried his ID with him. He was used to carrying it, but now, with the situation escalating, it felt like they were pushing him into a corner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, then handed over his ID without saying a word. The officer took it, scrutinizing it for a long moment, as if it might hold some hidden clue to who he was. During this time, the woman continued to watch from a distance, her posture rigid. He wondered what was going through her mind. Was she worried? Proud? Regretful? He couldn't tell, but whatever it wasn't good. Finally, the officer handed the ID back to the jogger. "Okay," he said, his tone still measured but with a hint of finality. "You're free to go. But we'll be keeping an eye out. This neighborhood is meant to be safe for everyone." The jogger nodded slowly, still processing everything that had happened in the last few minutes. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. He turned and began walking away, his legs feeling heavier with each step. His jog was over. His morning, now permanently altered, had come to an end. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Something had shifted. The air felt colder, more distant, and the neighborhood that had once felt like home now felt like a place he no longer recognized. Behind him, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw the woman approaching the officers. They were talking, but the words were too muffled for him to hear. She wasn't leaving. He knew she had more to say. He didn't know why she had done what she did, why she had called the cops on him. He didn't know if she had any regrets, or if she was feeling proud of herself. What he did know was that this wasn't over. Not for her, and certainly not for him. The jogger reached the corner, his mind racing. He was already replaying the scene in his head, wondering if he could have done anything differently, anything to make it stop. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. And then, as he turned the corner, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving. He looked up, and there it was, the same squad car, slowly driving down the street. They were coming after him. But why? What was going on now? As the car inched closer, he could see the officers' faces, their eyes scanning the street as if they were searching for something, anything, that might confirm their suspicions. But there was nothing. The jogger was just a man, trying to get through the day. And yet, it seemed like the world was pushing him into a story he never wanted to be part of. His heart pounded in his chest, and he quickened his pace, not out of fear, but out of frustration. He didn't know what was coming next, but he could feel the weight of it, the feeling of being watched, judged, and misunderstood. He turned another corner, now running with purpose. There was no telling how long this would last. Would he ever be able to just run again without feeling like his every step was under a microscope? Would this moment be the one that defined him from now on? And as the sound of the squad car faded into the distance, he couldn't help but wonder, would anyone ever hear his side of the story? Or was he forever going to be seen as just another suspicious figure in the eyes of a few? The tension hung heavy in the air, unanswered questions swirling like a storm on the horizon. The jogger's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he picked up his pace, his feet pounding against the pavement in rhythmic urgency. He didn't know why he was running faster. He wasn't being chased anymore. Or at least, that's what he hoped. But the feeling of being pursued, of being under a watchful eye, lingered like a shadow, dogging his every step. His mind raced through everything that had just happened, trying to make sense of it. But nothing fit together. The confusion, the fear, the odd sense of helplessness, it all mixed into a strange, unsettling brew. As he turned down another street, the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance, fading as quickly as they came. His shoulders sagged in relief, but it was short-lived. He still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the morning hadn't unfolded the way it should have. Was he overreacting? No. He couldn't shake the sensation that his presence in this neighborhood had somehow been criminalized, reduced to a suspicious figure for reasons beyond his control. He'd never felt that way before. Never had his simple existence been scrutinized as if it was a threat. This wasn't just about the police showing up, it was about the assumptions that had led to the call in the first place. Meanwhile, at the other end of the street, the woman who had made the call stood with the officers, her posture tense, her hands still gripping her phone. The officers were talking to her now, their voices low, though he could tell from their gestures that they were still focused on the suspicious man. Was she explaining her side of the story, or was she merely justifying her actions? The jogger couldn't know, but the thought of it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He tried to push the thoughts away as he slowed down, his breathing returning to normal. The path ahead seemed clearer now. But something about that woman's face kept haunting him. Her expression had been a mix of concern, suspicion, and something else, maybe fear, maybe regret, maybe something deeper, something more complex. She hadn't known him. She hadn't tried to understand him, to ask what he was doing or why he was there. She had jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than his appearance, the color of his skin, and the unfamiliarity of his presence. The jogger didn't want to believe it, didn't want to let himself sink into the dark pit of assumptions, but it was hard to deny the weight of what had happened. And there was no getting away from the uncomfortable reality that this had happened before. To countless others, in neighborhoods just like his. People like him, black, brown, different, who were constantly treated like they were out of place, always under scrutiny. It was something so deeply embedded in society, it was hard to even recognize when it happened, let alone fight it. But today, it had happened to him. And it had been far too real. As the jogger continued walking, he saw an elderly man coming toward him. The man was walking slowly, cane in hand, eyes bright despite his age. As they passed each other, the jogger couldn't help but notice the way the man looked at him, his gaze lingering a bit too long. It wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't warm either. It was as though the elderly man had some unspoken question in his eyes, a judgment that hadn't been voiced but still hung between them. The jogger felt it, the weight of it pressing down on him. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. The feeling stuck with him as he rounded the final corner to his street. It had always been quiet here, peaceful even. People waved as they passed, offered a smile, or a kind word. It had always felt like home, a place where nothing ever seemed out of place. But today, it felt different. The houses lined up in neat rows, the perfectly manicured lawns, the friendly faces all suddenly felt alien. At the end of the block, he could see his house. The simple, small house that had been his sanctuary, his escape. He walked up the front steps and opened the door, the quiet sound of the hinges creaking as it swung open. Inside, the familiar scent of morning coffee and the soft hum of the refrigerator greeted him. But nothing felt normal anymore. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do next. What had happened out there? What was the right thing to do? He didn't have answers. He barely had the energy to process what had just occurred. All he knew was that something deep inside him had shifted, and it wasn't just the events of the morning. It was everything: how easily his presence had been questioned, how swiftly things had escalated. The door behind him creaked again. He turned, expecting to see his neighbor. But it wasn't her, it was someone else, someone from a few houses down. A woman in her 30s, holding a grocery bag. She glanced at him with an expression that wasn't quite judgmental, but it wasn't friendly either. "Hey," she said, hesitating. "I don't know if you know, but there's a lot of talk around here about what happened earlier." He didn't respond right away. The words hung in the air like a weight, and he felt himself bracing for whatever would come next. He'd barely processed what had happened in his own head, let alone how to explain it to someone else. But the woman wasn't waiting for an answer. "I just wanted to say that we've all been hearing about it," she continued. "People are saying. Well, they're saying you were doing something wrong. They said the police had to stop you. I just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay." Her tone was careful, unsure, like she was treading on unfamiliar ground. He couldn't tell if she was trying to be kind or if she was just curious, but either way, her words didn't feel like support. They felt like more fuel for the fire, more weight pressing down on him, more judgment creeping in. "I'm fine," he said, trying to sound calm. I'm fine. Just a misunderstanding. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, then she nodded, as if accepting his answer without fully understanding it. She turned to leave, but before she did, she glanced back over her shoulder. I just wanted you to know that people are talking. They're worried. You don't belong here, you know? You might want to stay out of sight for a while. And with that, she was gone, walking briskly back down the street, her grocery bag swinging at her side. Her words echoed in his mind as he stood there, trying to make sense of what she had just said. Stay out of sight? Because of what? Because of who he was. As the door closed behind him, the jogger felt his world closing in, each piece of the puzzle falling into place in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't just a man out for a run anymore. He was a problem. A question mark. A mystery to be solved. But not by him, by the people around him, who had made up their minds before they'd even spoken to him. And that was the hardest part, the feeling that no one cared enough to ask, no one cared enough to listen. The longer he stood there, the heavier the silence became. He didn't know what was going to happen next. The tension was still thick in the air, hanging like a cloud over everything. And as the days stretched on, the jogger realized something. This wasn't just his story. This was everyone's story. It was a story about how assumptions are made, how fear spreads, and how easily the weight of one person's actions can impact someone else's life. And this story was far from over. The jogger stood in the doorway, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on him like a vice. Stay out of sight, she had said, as though his mere presence was enough to stir suspicion. He closed the door quietly behind him, not wanting to make a sound, as though the house might somehow protect him from the unspoken judgment of the world outside. But it didn't. It never had. And today, more than ever, it felt like the walls around him were closing in. He moved through the house like a ghost, aimless, his mind racing with every thought of what had just happened. The morning's events repeated in his head in a never-ending loop. The woman's call, the police, the tension in the air. But more than that, it was the way people were looking at him now. The looks weren't as obvious as the woman's, but he could feel them. The way people avoided his gaze, the way their heads turned quickly when he passed, the murmurs he could barely catch. They were all talking, making judgments about something they didn't understand, something that wasn't their business to understand. Was it really that simple? Was he just a jogger, in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was he something else? A threat? A problem? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. It wasn't just about the call anymore, it was about everything that came after, everything that had been built on a single, flawed assumption. There was a knock at the door. It was too soon. Too much was still hanging in the air. He didn't want to answer it, didn't want to face whatever might be on the other side. But the knock came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, he walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy, as though each one was dragging him towards something he couldn't avoid. When he opened it, he found a different face, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a business suit, holding a notepad. The man's eyes flicked toward the jogger with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Are you all right? The man asked, his voice soft but steady. The jogger hesitated, unsure what to say. I'm fine, he said again, though his voice betrayed him, wavering as he spoke. It felt like a lie, even to himself. I saw what happened earlier, the man continued, his gaze never leaving the jogger's face. I don't want to make any assumptions. But people are talking about it. There's a lot of talk going around. People are worried. Worried? The jogger frowned. What is there to worry about? The man shifted his weight uncomfortably. I don't know. But I heard from a few people that you were being detained. The police said they had to talk to you about something. Some kind of incident. They didn't say much, but it's making people nervous. The jogger's throat tightened, the words stinging as they were spoken aloud. He hadn't realized just how far the rumor had spread. The more the story was retold, the more it changed, until it became something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the reality of what happened. "You heard about that?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly, though he was trying to control it. "That wasn't what happened. I was just out for a run. She called the cops on me because she thought I looked suspicious. That's it. Nothing happened." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression softening, but only slightly. "I'm sure that's how you see it," he said, his tone dipping into something more sympathetic. "But the way things are being talked about, people are getting scared. And when people are scared, things can escalate." The jogger felt a bitter taste rising in his mouth. This wasn't the help he'd expected. It wasn't the reassurance he needed. He didn't want sympathy or pity. He wanted people to see him for who he was, a neighbor, a man going about his day, just like anyone else. "I'm just trying to go about my life," he muttered, stepping back from the door. "But it's like I can't do that anymore. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, someone's going to see something different." The man hesitated at the threshold, eyes scanning the jogger's face, then nodded slowly. "I get it," he said, though his words felt hollow. "But people like to talk. You know how it is. They don't always have all the facts." The jogger didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, like an unspoken truth no one dared to voice. The man gave him a quick glance before turning to leave, his footsteps trailing off down the street. But as soon as the jogger closed the door, he heard the unmistakable sound of another car pulling up outside. His pulse quickened, his heart thudding in his chest. This time, it wasn't the police. It was a black SUV, slow and deliberate in its approach, the tires crunching on the gravel. The jogger's breath caught in his throat as the vehicle came to a stop right in front of his house. Two figures emerged from the SUV, both tall, both dressed sharply, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. One of them spoke into a radio, and the jogger's stomach sank. He couldn't tell what was being said, but the words carried weight, urgency. The figures moved with purpose, and it wasn't long before they approached his door. He wanted to run. He wanted to hide. But there was nowhere left to go. He was already trapped in this story. He opened the door before they could knock, standing tall but feeling smaller with every step. "We need to talk," one of the men said, his voice firm but not unkind. "About the incident. We're investigating." "Investigating?" The jogger blinked, his mind reeling. "What is there to investigate? It's over. There's nothing to investigate." The man glanced at his partner, then back at the jogger. "You'd be surprised. These things have a way of spiraling out of control. You should know that by now." The words felt like a punch to the gut. He'd barely been able to process what had happened, and now it seemed like everything was spiraling faster than he could keep up. The tension that had been building all day was reaching a breaking point. Whatever had started as a simple jog had now turned into something much larger, something that felt out of his control, something that could ruin everything he had worked for. The SUV's engine hummed faintly in the background, and the air between the jogger and the two men seemed to thicken with every passing second. The weight of their presence felt suffocating, their unspoken power hanging over him like a storm cloud ready to burst. It wasn't just about him anymore. The ripple effect of one small action had turned into something much bigger, something that could not be undone. And as the tension reached its peak, he realized this moment wasn't just about defending himself. It was about facing the reality of how things had gone terribly wrong. With every breath, with every word that passed between them, the final act of this story loomed closer. The pieces were all in place. The questions had been asked, And now, all they needed was one answer: the truth, or what they would decide was the truth. The climactic moment was fast approaching. The jogger stood frozen in the doorway, his mind spinning as the two men from the SUV exchanged glances. Something about their cold professionalism felt off, almost rehearsed. He could sense that this wasn't just another police inquiry. It felt deeper, more calculated, as if they already had their minds made up. But what did that mean for him? Was he about to be dragged into something far worse than a simple misunderstanding? One of the men stepped forward, his face a mask of neutrality, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, or perhaps something darker. "We need your full cooperation," he said, his voice clipped. "There's been an escalation in the situation. It's not just about the call anymore." The jogger's pulse spiked. "Escalation? What do you mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder at the black SUV, then back at the jogger. "There's a statement that needs to be clarified. And it's important that we get your side of the story fully." "Get my side?" The jogger's voice shook as he tried to steady himself. "I already told you. There's nothing more to it. A woman called the cops because she thought I was suspicious, and they came to check me out. End of story." But the man shook his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "It's never that simple. Not when people start talking." His partner shifted behind him, pulling out a small tablet and glancing at the screen. "There's been a lot of misinformation circulating. Some of it serious." A chill ran down the jogger's spine. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. Misinformation? What had the woman told the police, and what had she told others? The jogger's gut told him something had gone horribly wrong, and he was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. Before he could ask another question, the second man spoke, his tone a little more urgent now. "We've got reports of a witness claiming that during the call, you made threatening gestures toward the woman." The jogger's heart skipped. "What? That's not true." "I didn't." He stopped himself, trying to regain control. His mind raced back to the scene. He had raised his arms to defend himself, yes, but it wasn't threatening. He had been confused, frustrated, but he never intended to escalate anything. The very thought that someone could twist that into something violent made his blood run cold. The first man, the one who had spoken earlier, leaned in, his voice lowering. "It doesn't matter what you intended. The fact is, that's what people are saying. And when people start telling stories, those stories have consequences." The jogger felt like the walls were closing in, each word from these men feeling more like a trap being set around him. He had never expected something like this to happen, never imagined his simple jog could lead to an avalanche of accusations. And yet, here it was, a spiral of tension and fear, all centered around something so small, so innocent. "I didn't do anything," he insisted, his voice growing more desperate. "This is all a misunderstanding." The second man, the one who had been typing on the tablet, looked up, his expression unreadable. "We know. But that's not the story that's out there. And the longer we let it fester, the worse it's going to get for you." The jogger took a step back, trying to process what they were saying. He couldn't let this continue. If these stories started to spread, if people began to believe that he had done something wrong, it would be over for him. The damage would be done. But then, the first man's next words hit him like a thunderclap. "There's also something else we need to discuss," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Something that might make all of this worse. We've just received a new report, and it changes everything." The jogger's breath caught in his throat. What could possibly change everything? He had already felt like his entire life was unraveling, like the world around him was shifting in a direction he couldn't follow. But this was different. The sudden change in the officer's demeanor told him that something far more serious was on the horizon. "What report?" the jogger asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The second man spoke now, his words chilling. "We've been informed that the woman who called the police, she's not the only one who's been watching you." The jogger blinked, trying to wrap his mind around what was being said. "What do you mean?" "There's surveillance footage," the first man said, his voice low, almost a warning. "From a nearby security camera. We've seen it, and it paints a very different picture of what happened." The jogger's blood ran cold. Security footage? What could that possibly show? Could it confirm what he knew to be true, that he had done nothing wrong? Or was it something else? His mind raced, but no matter how many times he replayed the events in his head, he couldn't figure out how they could have possibly gotten surveillance footage of the encounter. The second man continued, "You're not just being looked at by your neighbors. You're being watched by others, people who have no reason to give you the benefit of the doubt." The jogger felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just about the woman and her call anymore. This was about something bigger, something that was spiraling out of control, pulling him deeper and deeper into a web he couldn't escape. "What does the footage show?" the jogger asked, his voice barely audible now. The two men exchanged a quick glance, and for the first time, there was something like hesitation in their eyes. "We don't know yet," the first man said. "But we need to talk to you more about it. We need to know what you were doing at the exact time it was recorded." The jogger's mind swirled with questions. What was on that footage? What was so damning about it that they were willing to drag him into a deeper investigation? What had he missed? "You've already made up your mind," the jogger said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "You're not here to listen. You're here to find a way to pin something on me. To make it my fault." The first man's gaze hardened, and the jogger could see the tension building behind his eyes. "We're here to find out what happened," he said, his voice barely concealing the edge of threat. "But if you don't start being honest with us, this will go a lot worse for you. We're not asking questions for our health." Before the jogger could respond, the SUV's engine rumbled again, louder this time, as if to remind them of the gravity of the situation. There was no turning back now. Everything had changed. Every word, every action now carried weight. As the two men turned to leave, their footsteps heavy on the porch, the jogger's mind raced with new questions. What was on that footage? How could it be used against him? And who else was watching? The tension was thick enough to cut through, and as the men walked away, the jogger knew he was about to lose control of everything. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the house, the echoes making the jogger feel smaller, more isolated. The weight of the conversation was still hanging over him, a constant, suffocating presence. But as the SUV rumbled off into the distance, something else stirred inside him. It wasn't just fear, it was a sense of dread, of something much larger looming just out of sight, something that was about to pull him deeper into a situation he couldn't control. He had already told them everything, hadn't he? But they weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for something to latch onto, something to pin on him, something that would turn the entire story upside down. His pulse was still racing as he paced through the house. Each step felt heavier than the last. The house had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the outside world. But now, it felt like a cage. It felt like he was being watched, even though no one else was there. The walls seemed to close in with each passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that footage. What exactly had they seen? He thought back to his jog. No, he hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. He had kept to the same path, just like every other morning. But what if the footage showed something he hadn't even realized? What if there was more to that moment than he could recall? The jogger ran a hand over his face, frustration building with every unanswered question. And then it hit him. It was the woman. She wasn't just a witness. She was something else, something far more dangerous than he had initially realized. He'd assumed her call had been a rash, impulsive reaction, nothing more than an overzealous response to someone running down the street. But what if she had been playing a game of her own? What if the entire thing had been orchestrated, from the very beginning? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden buzzing noise. The jogger glanced at his phone, his stomach dropping when he saw the number. It was an unknown caller, but something in his gut told him that he needed to answer it. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end, then a low voice, calm, but with an edge of something darker. "You're in over your head." The jogger's heart rate spiked. "Who is this?" he demanded, his mind racing. "You know who I am," the voice replied, this time with a hint of amusement. "Let's just say I've been watching, too. I'm the one who saw it all." The jogger froze. He felt his breath catch in his throat. Saw it all? What did that mean? Was it a prank? Or was this yet another twist in a web he couldn't even begin to untangle? "Who is this? What do you want?" The jogger's grip tightened on the phone. His thoughts were spinning, each one more frantic than the last. "I want you to understand," the voice said slowly, drawing out each word. "That footage? You think it's just about the woman calling the cops? No, that's not the story anymore. You're being played. She's not the only one with an agenda. There are others, people who have been watching, gathering information, waiting for the right moment." The jogger felt the ground shift beneath him. What was this person talking about? His mind raced back to the earlier conversation with the men from the SUV. They had said there were others watching him. But what did that even mean? How deep did this go? "You're not just part of a misunderstanding," the voice continued, its tone growing colder. "You're part of something much bigger. Something much more dangerous. You've become a pawn, and you don't even know who's controlling the game." The jogger's blood ran cold. He stepped back, pressing his hand to his forehead as if he could somehow stop the flood of questions overtaking him. A pawn? Controlled by someone? He could barely wrap his mind around it. His life, his simple morning jog, had it all been a setup? Was this whole thing part of a bigger plan that he couldn't see? "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. "What do you want from me?" The voice on the other end laughed softly, but it wasn't comforting. It was the laugh of someone who knew more than they should. "Oh, I don't want anything from you. Not yet, anyway. But I want you to know that you're not going to get out of this so easily. You're in the spotlight now. And I'm not sure you fully realize what that means." With that, the line went dead. The jogger stood there, phone pressed to his ear, the dead silence echoing in his mind. He could still feel the weight of the conversation settling into his bones. A pawn? Who was controlling this game? Suddenly, everything felt even more chaotic. His phone buzzed again this time. It was a message from an unknown number. The jogger hesitated for only a moment before he opened it, his heart pounding in his chest. The message was brief, almost too simple, but it carried a chilling message. It's not just the footage. It's what happens next. His breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? What was coming next? The jogger felt like he was on the verge of something terrible, something he couldn't escape. There was more to this story than he'd ever realized. More people involved, more lies being spun. He wasn't just dealing with an overzealous woman and a police investigation anymore. He was in the middle of a conspiracy, and every move he made seemed to be pushing him deeper into it. He paced around the room, trying to clear his head. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing second, he could feel his grip on reality slipping. There had to be a way out of this, right? There had to be someone he could trust, someone who could help him make sense of it all. But who? Everyone around him seemed to be caught in the same web, complicit in some way or another. The jogger's phone buzzed once more, and this time, the message was even more unsettling than the last. It was a single image, grainy, dark, but unmistakable. It was a picture of him running down the street that morning. But this time, the image had been altered. He could see it clearly now, in the background, faint but undeniable, a figure standing by the sidewalk, watching him. The jogger's heart skipped. He hadn't seen anyone there before, at least not that he remembered. Had someone been following him the whole time? Or had this figure been placed there after the fact, as part of some kind of manipulation? The image felt like a puzzle piece falling into place, but what did it mean? A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as he stared at the screen. He knew that whatever was happening next, whatever game had been set in motion, was about to reach its breaking point. And he had no idea what would happen when it did. The stakes had just been raised, and there was no going back. The jogger's mind was spinning, the images from the phone and the cryptic messages haunting him like a constant, gnawing presence. He could feel the walls closing in. Each new detail was another piece of a puzzle he didn't even know existed. What had started as a simple run, a simple moment of freedom, had escalated into something much darker, much more dangerous. And now, the threats were becoming real, tangible. He couldn't ignore them any longer. He needed answers, needed to confront whatever this was head on. There was no more hiding, no more waiting for someone else to show up and explain what was happening. If he wanted to end this, he had to take control. The jogger made a decision in that moment. He wasn't going to wait for the next twist. He was going to find the woman. He had to know the truth, had to understand what had been happening behind the scenes. Why had she called the cops? Was she really just frightened, or had she been a part of something else all along? There were too many unanswered questions, and he knew now that finding her was the key to untangling everything. It was late in the afternoon when he found himself standing outside her house, the shadows of the evening stretching long across the street. The house looked quiet, ordinary, but he could feel the weight of everything that had led him here, every phone call, every piece of the puzzle that had come together with a sickening inevitability. The jogger hesitated for a moment, his breath shallow, but then he stepped forward and rang the doorbell. The door opened after a long pause, and there she stood. The woman. The one who had started this whole chain of events. She looked just as he remembered, anxious, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to jump out at her from the shadows. But there was something different now. Something colder, harder in her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice stiff. The jogger swallowed his frustration and took a deep breath. "I need answers. I need to understand why you did it. Why you called the cops on me that day." Her eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of something like recognition, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "I told you everything when they came. I was just scared. I thought you were following me." "Don't lie," the jogger shot back, his voice rising without meaning to. "I know there's more to it than that. You were part of something. Weren't you?" She stiffened, her hand tightening around the doorframe. For a brief second, the jogger thought she was going to shut the door in his face, but then, she took a deep breath, and the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease. "Come inside," she said quietly. The jogger followed her inside, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined to get the answers he needed. The woman led him into a small living room, where the air felt thick with tension. She gestured for him to sit, but he didn't, instead pacing around the room, his mind working through the possibilities. She watched him for a long moment before speaking, her voice hesitant but steady. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This isn't just about you. You're part of something much bigger. Something that was planned long before you ever jogged down that street. The jogger froze. What do you mean? Who else is involved? She hesitated, biting her lip. You really don't get it, do you? You think it's just about a woman calling the cops? That's the smallest part of it. You were the perfect target, someone who wouldn't fight back, someone who wouldn't be able to prove anything. The jogger's stomach churned. Who planned this? What do you want from me? The footage wasn't the only thing being watched that day, she said, her voice suddenly darker, her gaze shifting away from his. There were other people there, people who have been keeping tabs on you. The phone calls you've been getting? They're part of a bigger plan. They've been orchestrating everything from the start, pulling strings, making sure you ended up right where you are. The jogger was starting to understand, but it didn't make sense. Why him? What had he done to deserve being pulled into this? She continued, her voice almost a whisper. You're a part of a game, a social experiment. You're the test subject. They've been watching your every move, your reactions to the pressure. It's all been set up, everything from the woman's phone call to the surveillance footage, the mystery calls. All of it. The jogger's heart was pounding now, his mind racing as the pieces fell into place. A social experiment? But who would do something like that? And why? Before he could voice his thoughts, the woman's expression shifted again. But there's more, she said, her voice urgent now. There's something you need to know. The people behind all of this. She stopped herself, looking around the room as if she were afraid someone might be listening. They've been following me, too. I didn't just make the call to you by chance. I was forced into it. They made me do it. They threatened me, my family. And if you think they'll stop with you, if you think they'll leave you alone once this is over, you're wrong. It's never over. They'll keep watching. The jogger felt his world tilt. What had started as a nightmare of one bad encounter had now spiraled into something far worse, something even more dangerous than he could have imagined. He had thought he was just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, but now he knew this wasn't a coincidence. He was part of something bigger, something sinister. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. The jogger's heart skipped a beat. He turned to the woman, whose face had gone pale. She stood, trembling, clearly afraid. They're here, she whispered, barely audible. Before the jogger could react, the door burst open, and two men in black suits entered, their faces cold and expressionless. One of them held up a phone, showing him the exact same footage from that morning. It's time, one of the men said, his voice chilling. You've been chosen. And now, the real game begins. The jogger's stomach dropped as he realized the full scale of what had been happening. This wasn't just about a jogger and a woman's call. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme, a test of manipulation, fear, and control. And he had been its unwitting participant from the start. As the men closed in, the jogger's mind raced for an escape, but it was too late. The twist wasn't just that he had been a pawn. The real twist was that he had never been meant to win. The jogger's heart was pounding in his chest, his breath shallow as the men in black suits approached him, their eyes cold, calculating. He could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him with the realization of just how deep this went. This wasn't some random series of events. This was all part of a carefully planned experiment, a twisted game, and he had been the unsuspecting pawn from the very beginning. The woman's trembling face reflected the fear that gripped the jogger's heart, but she didn't speak. She just stood there, her hands clasped tightly together as though she were trying to hold on to something, anything, to keep her grounded in the face of the impending storm. The two men in suits stood silently for a moment, as if waiting for something, or perhaps simply observing him, sizing him up. The jogger's mind raced, his thoughts a blur as he searched for a way out. There had to be a way. He couldn't let himself be a part of this, couldn't let himself be manipulated any further. But how? How could he escape from this maze that had been constructed around him? One of the men stepped forward, his face expressionless, his voice low and deliberate. "You don't understand yet, do you?" he said. "You're not just a participant in this experiment, you're the result of it. Every action, every move you've made has been part of a bigger picture. You've been watched. Every step you've taken has been analyzed. This isn't just about one jogger on the street. It's about something much larger." The jogger's mind was spinning. He wanted to shout, to fight back, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He felt paralyzed, caught in the web of whatever this was. He glanced at the woman, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and fear, and he realized something in that moment. She wasn't just a victim in this game. She was part of it. And now he was, too. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice shaky. "Why me? Why all of this?" The man in the suit didn't immediately respond. Instead, he seemed to study the jogger for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, slowly, he spoke again. "Because you were the perfect candidate. You were vulnerable, unaware, and most importantly, you were predictable. That's the nature of this game. It's not about chaos. It's about control. And you," he paused, letting the words sink in. "You fit the profile perfectly." The jogger's chest tightened as he processed the words. He had never considered himself vulnerable, never thought of himself as someone who could be manipulated like this. But now, in this moment, it all made sense. Every phone call, every interaction, every strange turn of events, it had all been leading him to this point, this confrontation. The second man stepped forward now, his voice smooth but chilling. "You're a subject in an experiment designed to test the limits of human behavior. How far can people be pushed before they break? How much can we control them without them even realizing it? You've been the perfect case study." The jogger's mind was reeling. The realization that his life, his actions, had been nothing more than data for these people to analyze was like a punch to the gut. But even as the anger and disbelief surged within him, he knew that the only way out now was to stay calm, to think. If he let himself fall into the fear, he would lose. "You think you've been in control all this time," the first man continued, "but in reality, it's always been about how much you're willing to let go of, how much you're willing to give up in order to survive. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. This experiment is just one piece of a much larger plan. It's about shaping society, creating a reality where control is the ultimate currency." The jogger could feel his head spinning. It was too much to process, too much to understand all at once. But even as the gravity of their words settled into him, he knew he couldn't stay passive, couldn't just let them dictate the terms. He had to fight somehow. Even if he didn't know how, he couldn't just let this happen. Then, a thought struck him. The phone. The messages. Everything they had been monitoring, everything they had been controlling, it had all been through his phone, his life. If he could somehow use that, turn their own system against them, maybe he could break free. The jogger's eyes flickered toward the woman. She was still standing silently, her face pale, her eyes downcast. Something in her expression told him that she was no longer fully on their side. She was just as trapped as he was. Without warning, the jogger lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. "I need your help," he whispered urgently, not daring to raise his voice. "I know they've been watching you too. You don't have to be a part of this. We can fight back." For the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, followed by something else. It was fear, but also something more, a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. The jogger didn't waste a second. He pulled her toward the door, trying to ignore the men's stares, trying to ignore the pounding of his own heart as they made their escape. But before they could reach the door, the second man stepped forward, blocking their path. His expression was cold, calculating, but there was a certain calmness to it that made the jogger's skin crawl. "You think you can escape?" the man asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been marked. There's no running from this now." The jogger froze. He felt like a cornered animal, trapped with nowhere to go. But as he looked into the woman's eyes, he saw something unexpected, a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let them win. Not anymore. The jogger made his move. He shoved the man aside, his strength fueled by desperation. They bolted out the door, running as fast as they could down the street, not looking back. For a moment, it felt like they might actually make it. But then, the sound of footsteps behind them, fast, steady, closing in, made the jogger's blood run cold. They were being pursued. He didn't know how much time they had. His legs were burning, his breath ragged, but he refused to stop. There had to be a way out. He glanced at the woman, whose face was twisted in fear, but there was also determination there. They couldn't give up now. And then, just as the footsteps seemed to be right behind them, there was a sudden noise, a screeching car, tires burning against the pavement, and a vehicle skidding to a halt in front of them. It was a police car. The jogger's heart raced as he looked at the officers inside, but they didn't get out. Instead, they just sat there, watching him, watching both of them. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, no one moved. The jogger wasn't sure what to think. Were they finally going to be rescued? Or was this just another part of the game? Before he could make up his mind, the door of the car opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in plain clothes, his face stern, his eyes hard, but there was something familiar about him. The jogger's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man from the footage, from the SUV, the one who had watched him earlier. "You've been a part of this experiment, too," the man said, his voice low. "But now it's over. You both need to leave. You're free." The jogger's mind raced. Free? How could he be free when everything around him was still so uncertain, so dangerous? He couldn't just walk away, couldn't just forget everything that had happened. He turned to the woman, but she didn't speak. She just nodded, as if she understood. With one final glance at the man, the jogger and the woman turned and walked away, leaving behind the chaos, the manipulation, and the uncertainty. As they disappeared into the night, the jogger's mind was still reeling, still uncertain of what had just happened. But one thing was clear: the game was over. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might finally be able to breathe. But even as they walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't really over. Not yet. There would always be someone watching. Always another game to play.